But I do want to speak for a few minutes about the Amazon Synod. For the past month, I was in Rome as one of the 2 American delegates to the Synod. And basically, it's a regional synod, and it was set up to focus on the issues of the Amazon and 3 different levels of conversion that need to occur within the region to face the problems there. One is pastoral conversion, another is cultural conversion, and the final is ecological conversion. And so all of the bishops of that region, they were from all different countries, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, for the Antilles. All of those bishops were there. Representatives of the women religious and the men religious and lay leaders, particularly lay indigenous leaders, were there in the synod and spoke at the synod. And it was a wonderful experience, but it brought to heart all of these issues which Dr. Ramanathan has spoken to us about today, because the Amazon is emblematic of the future of our world. It really is a test case for whether we can face the issues of climate change and environmental degradation in general, or whether we're just going to drift and let them persist. And I just want to point to several of the realities that exist in the Amazon. It was interesting because we also had a few bishops from the Congo that were there. And the reason is the Congo River Basin is very similar in many of its issues and possibilities for the world, because both are like lungs to the world. Those great forests help sustain the world and will be part of the solution of the world. And that's why it's so important what's going on in the Amazon and what's going on in the Congo Basin. But what's going on in the Amazon is this. On the pastoral level, which took a great bulk of our time, it was dealing with the issues that you have many remote villages, particularly for the indigenous peoples. And in those remote villages, the question was, how do we evangelize there? How do we bring the gospel of Jesus Christ there? How do we deal with enculturation so we meet people in their cultures and help sustain the faith and help sustain their cultures? And then on the level of the socioeconomic issues, there are tragic situations that are there, and we are all part of that. It was stunning to see the degradation, not just of the environment, but of the society that we are contributing to. It's not just the national policies in these countries, which are contributing to it, the economic policies, the exploitation, but literally socioeconomic circumstances are devastating, particularly the indigenous cultures. And leaders are being criminalized and killed for defending their territorial rights. The indigenous peoples tend to own the land as groups, as collectives, not individually. And so there's a great economic incentive to take that land away from people, to disappropriate them. And at the heart of that, there are mining groups that come in, companies that come in. I learned a lot of things. One of them is most of the mining companies in the Amazon region that are really poisoning the land in many ways and exploiting and expropriating the land. Most of them are actually Canadian companies. They're housed in Canada. They're not necessarily in their origin Canadian. You know how countries gravitate to where the loosest laws are to incorporate? Well, that's Canada. And so terrible conditions go on there. And they tried to pass laws in Canada to help with this situation, but then they simply evacuated it of all teeth, so that even though it's illegal to do many things in Canada if you're a mining company, it's not illegal to do it for a Canadian company if you're operating in these areas. It's great tragedies. These are the injustices, as you were speaking about the the two worlds. This is what goes on. One of the very powerful elements of this was that the church in the Amazon is literally a church of the martyrs. In the procession, when we came over for the first day of the meeting, we came over from St. Peter's Basilica and then moved over to the Synod Hall. And the indigenous leaders led the procession, and there were about 60 of them. And they brought into the Synod Hall pictures of their martyrs. And some of them, Dorothy Stagg, you would know, Oscar Romero, but many of them are names not known to us, but contemporaries. Those who are being martyred because they're defending the fundamental rights of people. And speakers would speak about this. This is a church of the martyrs. We're a church of the martyrs where we know we were built on the martyrs in many ways. This is a church of the martyrs because they know martyrs. One bishop got up and talked about one of his priests who had been in one of the villages, and one of the indigenous leaders had gone out to defend the rights, and they knew he was going to be killed. So the priest was going to go with him to at least accompany him. And he would be killed too. And so the villager said to the priest, "No, don't go, because you'll be killed too." And the priest said, "If he goes and is killed, he's killed alone. If I go with him, I die with Christ." Now this is the reality that goes on in this region. And the whole socioeconomic structures and injustices that surround it, okay? And we have to understand this is part of what we have to address too. That's why when the Pope talks in Laudato Si about the ecology, he doesn't talk about it simply as the environment in the physical sense. He talks about it as a human ecological development. That means it has to address, as Dr. Ramanathan was saying, it has to address the socioeconomic as well. And there are important questions that have to take place there. We can't wish a world in which we are transformed here without making sacrifices. We're going to have to make sacrifices. But we have to address the socioeconomic issues as well as the environmental issues. But there was a tremendous emphasis in the whole series of discussions too on the fact that we are nearing catastrophe, and on the fact that we in our generation are simply stealing the future from the next generation. We have to face up to that fact. And none of us like facing that reality, but that's the reality that we are living in. In the culture of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon, they have a very beautiful concept, and it's called the good life. And you know what the good life means in the United States. It means living in luxury and not having to work a lot. For them, the good life means this. It means living in right relation with God, with yourself, with those in your family, in your village, in your society, and with the earth. That's what the good life is. And we, in our own culture, have to understand more that that's what the good life can and should mean for us too. We're not going to live like the people in the Amazonian villages do. That's just not going to happen. All right? And it doesn't have to happen. But we do have to have a sense of what really is the good life for us. What does our society seek? What do we seek by our individual choices? And so the feeling in the Synod was that the way toward the future, and it was the same thing we were just talking about, is a coalition. And the feeling was the coalition is threefold, but in the Synod felt the coalition needs to be the religious communities of the world, the scientific community, and young people, that's the third tier. Because when we're seeing with the movement of young people, they get it. This is their future. For us, it's a little more remote. But for them, it is their future. It's the future they will live in. All these timelines look different for me than they do to somebody who's 16 or 17 years old. And that's a really good thing. And people don't want to rob the future of their children and grandchildren. And that's the point of conversion we have to have. That God calls us to a sense of moral responsibility. And that we have to make choices. The great problem in our society, frankly, in all the modern societies now, we tend to put off hard choices in our society. We've structured now political choices so that short-term always dominates over long-term. That didn't used to be the case. That was not the case before about 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, there was always some of it, but there was much more of a long-term perspective that could work in political life here in our country. And that's much diminished now, much marginalized. And that's what we have to bring back on this set of topics. A sense of long-term and understanding what the stakes are. We said in the report at the end, in the small group that I was in, we asked that the line be put in, later is too late. And I really believe, we believe that is true. The Synod adopted that and put it in the final report. Later is too late. If we wait another 10 years, which is what we're doing now, then it will be too late. We're too far toward the tipping points that reversing it then is going to become so much harder, and in terms of social choice will likely become impossible. It's already becoming impossible in the Amazon. The Amazon rainforest now, 17% of it's gone. The tipping point, the irreversible point, is around 40%. And it's moving toward that progressively. During the nuclear crises between the United States and the Soviet Union, when we had big nuclear arsenals, do you remember, how many of you are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? All right? How many of you got under your desks at school in the practice as to what you're supposed to do, as if your desk would protect you from a nuclear attack? Yes, we did. But during that period of time when there was great danger of a nuclear confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, we had such big nuclear arsenals and weapons that could be triggered so easily. At that time, this public policy group in the world and the scientists, the atomic scientists, formed a clock. They had a clock they came up with. And they said, how many minutes to midnight are we? Midnight meaning the end of the world, which would be a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so as all during that period of time, as some big event would occur, they'd either move it closer to midnight, or if there was some progress in arms control, farther away. The closest it got was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And on a Saturday night, the United States had ordered an attack on Cuba, a strike that would have killed Russian soldiers and likely would have started an exchange. Luckily, it got settled right at the last moment. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, they moved that clock to 1 minute to midnight, okay? Because it was such a moment, and all of us who lived through that as kids, we remember that moment. We have now another clock which we're facing, and that's the ecological clock. The clock largely of climate change, but of environmental degradation in general. And the problem with that clock is it only keeps moving forward because we're not taking the right steps. We haven't adjusted it backward at all. It only keeps moving forward and moving to midnight. And it will be, the whole planet then becomes destabilized. And so what we have to really do as a society is to resolve this gift, which is God's gift to us. The whole of creation is God's gift to us. And those human lives, which are God's gift and placed into our care, we have to take that clock and smash it. by coming up with new ways of living that are not going to be impossible, but are not cost-free, certainly. And they will be uneasy in certain ways. But that is our responsibility as people of faith, as human beings with a sense of moral responsibility. That is what we are being asked to do. And so I just want to say, please, all of you in your various spheres, try to make effective this message and bring this message where you can. Because here in California, we see in these very days what's going on. It's beginning to dawn on us now. But we've got to take that and not just put that on the headlines a month from now and forget about it. We've got to take that to heart and say, this is what God is saying to us. We've got to act now. Thank you very much.